So if you remember our definition of the short run, so we're going to talk about long run and short run costs now, is some inputs have fixed levels. So we couldn't change the amount of some kind of inputs, right? And so let's say, example, factor or input 2 is fixed at x2 bar. So x2 equals x2 bar. So now the problem is, minimization problem is, this cost function, I'm going to put an S for short run here, it's going to be a function of how much y in this fixed level of input 2. And that's going to equal the min of W1 x1 plus W2 x2 bar. We only get to pick x1, and now we need to produce enough output that we get y units of output, right? We need enough x1 to get y units of output when used in conjunction with x2 bar here. So solution to this will depend on the amount and cost of the fixed factor if we have just 2 inputs, so like the problem written above, then it's really just about getting what's the minimal amount of input 1 we need to be used with x2 bar to produce y units. Input 1 that can be used that allows you to produce y units. And how we represent this is x1 equals x1s, again for short run, because I'm changing it to a superscript here to follow your book, but it's a function of W1, W2, x2 bar, and y. And then our x2, the amount of input 2 is just fixed, right? So maybe you might think of this as labor, and this is some kind of capital or something like that. And so the idea here is that we're fixing input 2 at some level. So we're really just minimizing the cost, trying to use the least amount of input 1 possible that still allows us to produce y units. So maybe we should put a subject to there. And that minimum amount of input 1 that minimizes the costs is going to depend on the price of each of the inputs, how much of this fixed factor we have, as well as how much output we have. And really, we could take this in and we could plug it back into our problem. If we want to represent this short-run cost function, what it's actually going to look like. So CS, which is a function of y and x2 bar. So again, it used to be a function of W1 and W2, but we talked about we're just fixing them now. But it's not just a function of y in the short run, our cost function, it's also a function of how much of this fixed factor we have. And it equals W1 times x1 star plus W2 times x2 star. And by star, I just mean the optimal amount. So really, it's W1 times x1s, which is a function of w1, w2, x2 bar, and y, plus w2 times x2 bar. So this is our short run cost function. So whatever amount of input one, the minimum amount we need to basically produce y, which is x1s, again the s is for short run, times its cost. Plus we have this fixed amount we have to pay no matter what, because capital is fixed, for instance. We can't change our building size. All right, so this is how the short run problem is. Now let's erase this board and talk about the long run. So in the long run, all inputs are variable. So we don't have that fixed amount of input 2. We have this, we can vary the amount of capital and labor. So then our problem is simply our cost function. Again, we got rid of the W1 and W2 because they're assumed to work constant, is the minimum of W1 x1 plus W2 x2. X1, x2 is going to be what we get to choose, subject to we're producing at least Y amount of units, or we are producing Y amount of units, I should say. This is the problem we saw before, right? This is kind of the problem we saw how to solve before. And we're going to get these derived, these conditional factor demand functions where the amount of input one we should use is a function of W1, W2, as well as Y. And then we have the same for how much input 2 we should use. And then our actual minimized cost function is then just W1 times this conditional factor demand function plus W2 times the conditional factor demand function for input 2. And so this is very similar to what we kind of saw before. The short run is a little bit different. Let's now talk about the relationship between the short run and the long run. And so let's assume again, factor prices are fixed. So W1, W2 are fixed. So now x1 is just x1, which is just a function of y, and x2 is x2, which is just a function of y. So the amount of HA inputs just depends on the production level, because we've kind of fixed W1 and W2 here. Well, what we can do, maybe actually I'll erase the board. We'll see if we can put it down here. What we can do is we can rewrite the cost function as cost function y is equal to the short run cost function of y when x2 is at its cost minimizing level. So this might seem weird, but what we're trying to say here, here's the long run cost function. There's no s, that's why we know it's the long run. The minimum, the cost minimizing level, the cost minimizing amount, when both inputs are variable, so we have this long run and we can change both the amount of x1 and x2, is simply equal to the short run cost function when we're at the cost minimizing amount of input 2. So we're at this minimizing amount. We're we figured out what this is. And we're saying, well, we're at that cost minimizing amount. of input 2, well then, our cost function in the long run is the same as our cost function in the short run. The choices will be the same as long as we're at this cost minimizing amount of input 2. So that's this kind of relationship between the short run and the long run.